That's the number of confirmed criminal offenses. 34 of those were rapes. The victims were aged between 5 and 75. The man responsible died with a knighthood. He received a state-assisted funeral. He was never charged with a single offense. His name was Jimmy Savile. But this video is not about Jimmy Savile. Every documentary, every tabloid, every retrospective has already told you about the monster. This is about the institutions, the BBC, the NHS, the police, the honor system. Each one was handed evidence, formal complaints, staff testimony, and each one made a choice. We have the documents that prove it. James Wilson Vincent Savile was born in Scarborough, Yorkshire in 1926. Youngest of 7, working class, Catholic. By the 1940s, he was a coal miner by day and a dance hall promoter by night. By the early 1960s, he had reinvented himself completely. Disc jockey, television personality, national treasure. In 1964, he began hosting Top of the Pops. In 1975, he began hosting Jim'll Fix It, a show where children wrote letters asking to have their wishes granted. At its peak, that show received over 20,000 letters per week from children. By the 1970s, Savile had been granted unrestricted access to NHS hospitals, Leeds General Infirmary, Stoke Mandeville, Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric facility. He was there as a charity fundraiser, a volunteer, a friend of management. He wore a key around his neck. That key gave him out-of-hours access to hospital wards, including children's wards, at night. In 1990, he was knighted. In 2009, Pope Benedict XVI gave him a papal knighthood. He died in 2011, surrounded by tributes. 1 year later, a documentary changed everything. And what came next became the largest investigation into historical sexual abuse in British legal history. Here's what most coverage gets wrong. Operation Yewtree, the NHS inquiry, the official investigations. They were not the first time authorities had information about Jimmy Savile. They were simply the first time that information produced consequences, because there were no consequences left to produce. The man was dead. Let's be precise. Let's look at the actual timeline. 1958, a 13-year-old girl reports to police in Rochdale that Savile sexually assaulted her at a dance event. No charges were brought. The record of that complaint sat in a file. 1963. Surrey police receive a complaint from a girl who says Savile abused her. No charges were brought. 1998. Surrey police conduct a full formal investigation following fresh allegations. Files were prepared. The case was sent to the Crown Prosecution Service. The CPS decided there was insufficient evidence to proceed. Savile was alive in 1998. He was 71 years old. He had years remaining on his BBC contract. He would go on to receive unrestricted NHS access for over a decade after that decision. These are not opinions. These are documented outcomes contained in the official Savile inquiries conducted between 2012 and 2014. Let's talk about the BBC. Savile joined the BBC in 1964. He remained a fixture until his retirement from presenting in the early 2000s. That's nearly 4 decades. In 2016, the BBC commissioned an independent review of its own institutional knowledge. It was called the Dame Janet Smith Review, and its findings were unambiguous. The review found that there were widespread rumors within the BBC about Savile's sexual interest in girls. that multiple BBC employees witnessed inappropriate behavior with girls on BBC premises, that artists of Savile's stature operated effectively above the rules that applied to everyone else. The review noted, and I want you to hear this language carefully, "We are satisfied that there were people at the BBC who knew or strongly suspected that Savile was abusing girls on BBC premises." Not suspected. Knew or strongly suspected. The review gave that category a name. It called it turning a blind eye. Not ignorance. A deliberate decision not to see. Why? And the Smith Review found that BBC management did not investigate complaints about Savile because of what it called a culture of deference to talent. In plain English, he was too valuable to challenge. That conclusion, that finding, is contained in a report the BBC itself commissioned and itself published. Now here is the specific sequence of events that has never been fully reckoned with. In 2011, the year Savile died, BBC Newsnight had been preparing an investigative report. Multiple victims had been interviewed. Substantial testimony had been gathered. The subject, Savile's abuse of girls at Duncroft-approved school. In late 2011, the Newsnight editor made the decision to drop the investigation. The official explanation was that the piece hadn't met editorial standards. Now here's the context that matters. Savile had died weeks earlier. The BBC was preparing a season of tribute programs in his honor. His image was on screens across the country. He was being publicly mourned. The Newsnight investigation, had it run, would have aired during or immediately after that tribute season. It was dropped. A year later, when ITV broadcast its own documentary, the question of what happened to that Newsnight investigation became central to the story. An external report, the Pollard Review, found that the decision to drop it had not been primarily editorial. It found that senior BBC management had been aware of the investigation at the time it was shelved. It found that communication between management and editorial had been confused, inadequate, and in some respects misleading. Director General George Entwistle resigned. No criminal charges were brought against any BBC executive. Between 1968 and 2004, Jimmy Savile held official or semi-official roles at 5 NHS institutions: Leeds General Infirmary, Stoke Mandeville, Broadmoor, Rampton Secure Hospital, Ashworth Hospital. The NHS investigations published in 2014 and 2015 found that Savile had abused patients, including children, at multiple institutions. At Stoke Mandeville, concerns had been raised by staff members. Those concerns had not been adequately investigated. Why not? Because Savile had raised £12 million for the hospital's CT scanner appeal. When you raise £12 million for an NHS hospital, the institution has a financial relationship with you. That relationship is not uncomplicated by moral questions. At Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric facility containing some of the most vulnerable patients in Britain, the story's even more specific. In 1988, Savile was appointed by the Department of Health to a task force overseeing the management of the hospital, not by a junior administrator, by the government department responsible for health policy in Britain. He was given his own room, his own key, freedom of movement within the facility. The Broadmoor investigation found that Savile had abused patients there. It found that staff had been aware of his inappropriate behavior. It found that a culture of secrecy and deference meant those concerns were never escalated. Here is the question that no public inquiry, No parliamentary committee and no official spokesperson has ever satisfactorily answered. And the concerns about Savile's conduct at NHS institutions were known to trust management. The formal complaints to Surrey Police in 1998 were processed at Crown Prosecution Service level. The BBC's own institutional knowledge of his behavior was documented in the Smith Review. These institutions were not operating in isolation. They were part of the same country, the same government, the same era. At what point, and this is the question, did knowledge at one institution become communicable to the others? Was there a moment where, if one person had made one phone call, the connections would have become impossible to ignore? We don't know, because no one has made them answer it. Here is why this still matters. Savile was not a uniquely clever predator who outsmarted every safeguarding system. He was a man who understood that institutions protect their own interests before they protect people. And he was right. The BBC protected its talent. The NHS protected its donors. The police protected the path of least resistance. The honors system handed out knighthoods without asking uncomfortable questions. None of this required a conspiracy. Conspiracies require coordination. This required something much more mundane. It required people to decide individually and independently that the cost of acting was higher than the cost of not acting. The official inquiries have named that pattern. Historians have documented it. Lawyers have argued over it. But the pattern itself, the institutional logic that says silence is easier, has never gone away. It is not a relic of a different era. It is how institutions work. Until they are forced not to. The headstone erected over Savile's grave was removed in 2012, smashed. At the family's request. They were worried about vandalism. His name was removed from buildings, from plaques, from records. As if erasure and accountability were the same thing. They are not. The documents are still there. The inquiries are still there. The names of the people who made those decisions are still there. And that is where the story actually lives.